Hello everyone, welcome to this evening's ThinkIn. I'm James Harding, I'm the editor and co-founder of Tortoise. I sometimes wonder what we're trying to do in putting the world of ideas and news to music, and perhaps more succinctly than we're going to do over the next hour. My colleague Mark and Andrew found that Sparks song, Talent is an Asset. And that is at the heart of this evening's conversation. I'll give you a little bit of background and why this discussion about meritocracy feels as though it's central to everything that we're trying to do at Tortoise. When we started our newsroom, I suppose it was in response to a feeling of being overwhelmed by the news, the speed and the volume of news, but also honestly to being unmoored, to feeling as though the ideas that many of us have grown up with and begun to take for granted were being challenged. And that was rooted in a sense of frustration by many people with the political system, a deep disbelief in the way in which our economy works and the inequality at the heart of the economic system, and more what my colleague Kerry Thomas looked at as the power gap, this widening gulf between those people who seem to shape the way we live and those of us who receive the rules and terms and conditions. And if you were to drill down to the very central idea, the idea that goes beyond left and right between, free markets or state interventions, the idea that seems to come at the heart of all of that is the idea that we live at a time where our individual talents are going to have a real impact on the lives we live, on the idea that it's the heart of Adrian Wooldridge's book, The Aristocracy of Talent, How Meritocracy Made the Modern World. And if you have the chance to read it, it's one of those books that has books within books. It's not enormously long, but it is deeply rich in that it examines the three great revolutions, the French, the American, and in the British liberal revolution, and pulls that thread of meritocracy together. And yet what Adrian also does is acknowledge the fact that meritocracy is an idea that's under attack. And Daniel Markovits, the Yale law professor, actually, as it happens, is teaching law right at this moment, so he's going to join us 10 minutes late when his lecture finishes, is going to join us in a moment because we'd really like to get to grips with the argument that Adrian makes, the merits of meritocracy, and the arguments that Daniel Markovits makes, which is the meritocracy trap, how it's failing to deliver on its promise. And so I'm going to hand over, if I might, for the first section here, though, to Adrian, because Adrian, if you would, I'd love you to make the argument of the book, to set out a little of the history of meritocracy and the impact you think it's made. And when Daniel joins us, we can get into a little bit of the set too. I think you've been to our ThinkIns before. You know, our aim is to bring in as many people as possible. Absolutely. So when people mention things in the chat or put their hands up, I'll try and bring them in as and when. So why don't you kick off, Adrian, and just sort of set out what the argument of the book is?
Well, let me start off with a brief definition of meritocracy. Meritocracy means judging people on the basis of their innate abilities rather than their superficial polish or their social connections or their social class or their social status and background, family connections and the rest of it. And I think it also means, implicit in the idea, is the notion that we get something approximating to equality of opportunity. At least we give people the basic ability to acquire the tools that they need to acquire to flourish in a modern knowledge economy. And I think a bit more than that, it means trying throughout society, not just at the top, but throughout society, to distribute opportunities and jobs on the basis of innate talents, on the basis of people's, what people have within them to get ahead. And you might say, many people would say, well, this is very obvious. It's apple pie. It's apple pie. Everybody knows that this is a good thing, and everybody wants it. But in fact, this was a set of assumptions that has not been accepted throughout most of human history. Throughout most of human history, jobs, positions, opportunities have been allocated on the basis of family connections, on the basis of social status, on the basis of patronage, and indeed bought and sold. And that has been the accepted way of doing things. Indeed, social mobility has been disapproved of. You read Shakespeare, Troilus and Cressida, it's, untuning the string of society. It's something that's profoundly disruptive. And secondly, not only are most societies organized on the basis of patronage and birth, but I think our fundamental human nature is such that we want to do our best for our children. And that means trying to push our children gently, surreptitiously sometimes, but sometimes not, to the front of the queue, to give them better opportunities. That's a genetically encoded thing in the way that we approach the world. So meritocracy, creating a fair set of rules, is in many ways deeply unnatural. We have to push against our basic human instincts. It's a sort of Hobbesian bargain that we all decide collectively to give up our desire to do the best for our children in order to create a more just and more efficient world. We all say, let's have some general rules to do things.
And Adrian, can I just ask you one thing? Because
yeah.
when you start reading the book, one of the things that sort of certainly makes me uncomfortable and I squirm a little is your reference to innate abilities, to intelligence, to your, as if these things were handed out unevenly and the system of meritocracy is going to realize that. You know, one of the things increasingly we're told is that we shouldn't overemphasize intelligence. We should actually stress diligence over intelligence. And so what do you take to mean by innate abilities?
Well, central to the meritocratic tradition is the idea that we don't just reward people for the good fortune of being born into the right family, into an educated, privileged family. And central to the meritocratic tradition is we're looking for abilities that haven't been discovered, the mute inglorious Miltons of the world. So, example, if you look at Cambridge University or Oxford University, they're putting an enormous amount of effort to looking for hidden Einsteins or hidden talent, people who have promise that hasn't been revealed in their education. So they say, if you've got two candidates, one who went to Eton and who's stuffed to the gills with learning, and another who went to an obscure school in the back of beyond Shropshire or somewhere like that, and they're both, one is a bit better than the other in that they've been better taught, but the other one shows more promise, then you're implicitly making a distinction between innate ability and acquired learning. So what I mean by innate ability is not just, let's say, IQ. I mean a sense of promise, a sense of what you would be like if you were given superior opportunities.
Well, can I ask you? I expect we're going to get back. I expect we're going to get back in this when Daniel arrives, because there is obviously this whole debate about the extent to which, you know, perceived intelligence, you know, keeps some people down and allows others to progress. But let's hold that for a second, if we could, because what I'd love to do is just get your read on how meritocracy did change the world. It's linked to the French Revolution, the American British Liberal Revolution.
Well, first of all, I said that for most of human history, society has been organized according to the principles of birth, patronage, even buying and selling jobs, which is a very common thing before the modern period. There were two big exceptions to this. One was the sort of Platonic tradition. If you look at Plato's Republic, Plato says that society should be organized on the basis of innate abilities, of people's intellectual horsepower. And he says that there are three classes of people: men of gold, men of silver, and men of bronze, and women of the same things. And that the job of social policy and of education is to find out people's innate capacities and to allocate them to the positions that they ought to have. And he says that what's interesting in his argument is that aristocrats, people at the top, don't necessarily produce aristocrats, don't necessarily produce people who should be at the top and should be Platonic guardians. He says there's always, in each new generation, a sorting process. So that's a very radical vision of the world that's there in Plato. And the second source of this sort of this meritocratic tradition is in China, which China had from a very early period onwards, a notion of promoting people on the basis of their performance in examinations. And it created an examination state, an extremely rigorous set of examinations which select people on the basis of their performance in exams and give them jobs in the imperial palace, in the state bureaucracy. And at the height of this system, very early on, you had about 10% of the population sitting exams, and you had a significant degree of social mobility on the basis of this. So these are the two great pre-modern traditions. But you know, in China, it's central to what's going on. In the West, the Platonic tradition is a bit more marginal, and in the West, status is still ascribed more than anything else. And you have three revolutions, which I describe in some detail in this book, which change all this. One is the American Revolution, which is made in the name of what they call natural aristocrats against what they call tinsel aristocrats or false aristocrats. And again, this distinction between people who are innately the right people to rule and people who've just been born into positions of privilege and who've had a sort of superficial education but are not really natural aristocrats. Jefferson says this, Madison says this, Hamilton says it's very eloquent. I'm a huge fan of Hamilton in this period. And they say that the point of the American Revolution is to replace a false aristocracy with a true aristocracy. Men of merit, mostly men in this case, should be promoted to run the country. And the same thing happens in the French Revolution. The French Revolution becomes a bit more radical than the American Revolution. But Napoleon comes along and he's very much looking to sort of create a career open to talents, selecting these natural aristocrats from across society and you know, putting them in charge of the state. He has a very elitist notion of the state where a meritocratic state can drive efficiency, justice, and all of this sort of thing. These are two. The French Revolution, a very violent revolution. The American Revolution, less violent, but nevertheless violent. Then there's another revolution, which I think is a particularly fascinating one, which is the English liberal revolution I associate with Gladstone in the 19th century, which is much more prolonged, but is a process really of permeation, whereby an intellectual aristocracy displaces a landed aristocracy. And it says, instead of being born to power because you have landed estates, you should acquire power on the basis of your learning, your ability to do examinations, your ability to get into. So you open the civil service to examinations, Oxbridge colleges to examinations. Oxbridge colleges used to give places on, you know, on the basis of whether you were founder's kin, you were connected to the founder on the basis of where you happen to be born, this sort of thing. Increasingly, they give it on the basis of examinations, and that's a sort of permeation strategy in England. And then this logic, we give places to people of ability on the basis of open competition, moderated by examinations, becomes extended. This is a small world we're talking about. I've talked about men, and I've talked about this sort of intellectual elite, intellectual aristocracy, but gradually this system is opened up to more and more people. Firstly, and most interestingly, you get women. Women say, well, if men are allowed to sit these examinations, if men are allowed to sit to prosper through open competition, why on earth shouldn't women be? So there's a wonderful occasion in Cambridge in 1890 when a woman called Philippa Fawcett sits the mathematics tripos. She's not allowed to sit formally the mathematics tripos, but she comes top. So she's ranked above the senior wrangler. So she's the top person. She has this marvelous phrase, above the senior wrangler, better than the top guy. And so this you know, what meritocracy has within it is this sort of inevitable radical thing, because once you start opening competition, you can't suddenly say, well, it's just for men, or it's just for white men, or it's just for, you know, people who went to Eton. By its very nature, it sort of admits all sorts of other people. So then you get working class people saying, well, you've got to build a ladder of opportunity so we can take part in this competition as well. And in the late 19th, early 20th century, you get this wonderful generation of sort of autodidact working class people who, you know, go to night schools, who go to workers' educational colleges, who immerse themselves in literature, in history, in the sciences, and who compete with the more privileged classes and beat them and slowly work their way into Oxford and Cambridge.
Well, Adrian, this is it's a perfect moment, because I think I'm right in thinking, I hope Daniel has joined us. Daniel Markovits, have you?
Hello.
Hello there, Daniel. So I'll tell you what you've missed. I'll tell you what you've missed while you've been engaged in the very meritocratic business of teaching students at Yale. Thank you for joining us on the back of the lecture. So what I asked Adrian to do, and sort of set this up in a way of saying, look, here's Adrian's book, An Argument in Favor of Meritocracy. Here's yours, pointing out its shortcomings. I actually just asked Adrian at the top. He offered a definition of meritocracy and then a sweep of history, the world before it, and some of the revolutions since. We haven't got, although you will see in the chat, we're teetering towards it, we haven't got to the critique of meritocracy and the issues around inequality and plutocracy and, as you'll have seen in the chat, corporatism and the impact on kids. But I thought rather than praising your book, I'll ask you to make the criticism that the Meritocracy Trap makes in the context of the book. I'm sure you've read it.
Yeah, great.
It's written.
Lovely. So first of all, thank you. Sorry to be a little late. Adrian, nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
I was coming from the law school's faculty workshop, which I'm co-chair of. So I've been running from thing to thing. I want to make 2 points. One of them, I think Adrian and I actually agree on the general point, but we disagree a little bit about both the facts and the prescriptions that follow from it. And then the second point is one on which I think Adrian and I probably disagree. The first concerns the effects of meritocracy on equality of opportunity. So advancing people based on their accomplishments is not the same thing as advancing people based on their native talents. And the reason why those two things come apart is that training and education work. And so different people get different quantities invested in turning their talents into accomplishments. Now, the early meritocracies, the things that Adrian has just been describing, did such a good job at opening up elites and advantage to outsiders because the old aristocratic elite was, to be blunt, not very clever and not very hardworking. And so when opportunity was given to people who accomplished things, outsiders who were both cleverer and harder working accomplished more and started getting ahead. But the new elite, the meritocratic elite, the group that won the prior generation's meritocratic competition, is extremely good at training its children and has a virtually unlimited appetite for training its children. So in the United States today, for example, an elite private school where maybe 80% of the children come from the top 5% of the income distribution invests $75,000 per child per year in educating children, whereas the average public school invests about $12,000 per year. This produces the consequence that the rich massively outperform not just the poor, but also the middle class on meritocratic assessments. On the SAT, which is the test that dominates US college admissions, a child whose parents are in the top 5% of the income distribution will outscore a middle-class child by 250 points on average. Even as a middle-class child will outscore a child at or below the poverty level by only about 125 points. So the rich middle-class gap is twice as big as the middle-class poor gap. And that's why elite universities, including my own, that have largely meritocratic admissions, have more children from the top 1% than from the entire bottom half. Now, it's also the case that US universities are corrupt in a way in which UK and certainly European continental universities are not corrupt. And alumni get a preference and rich donors get a preference. But the bulk of the effect I'm describing is not by these abominations, which Adrian and I both agree are abominations, but because the rich have figured out that a more effective way of privileging their children is within the meritocratic system rather than against it. And so meritocracy itself has now become a block to equality of opportunity.
Adrian, do you want to come back on that?
Yes, well, we keep coming back. I don't want to get into a great orgy of agreement, but we both agree that there's a real problem in the world at the moment, and it is associated in some sense with this word meritocracy. In my arguments, what we've seen is a corruption of the meritocracy by plutocracy. At the same time that we've seen within the state sector, the public sector, a diminution of the meritocratic appetite, as sort of an egalitarian revolution. So I think that we've seen
just go a little slowly with me.
Let me go more slowly. I think we've seen two revolutions going on. One is that the private educational sector, particularly in Britain, but also in the United States, has become more meritocratic in the sense that it's put massively more emphasis on educational qualifications. The Eton of the 1960s was a good chap school. The Eton of today is a grammar school with funny clothes. What you saw simultaneously with the comprehensive revolution in Britain is that state schools were putting less emphasis on social mobility, less emphasis on academic merit, and were more concerned with community, equality, people having a nice time, all of that sort of thing. So if you look at the Oxford that I went to in the 1980s, there were far more state school people at that university than there are now, because the grammar schools were undone. The state sector, the ladder of opportunity in the state sector for various reasons was dismantled. We're moving a bit away from that.
Is that really right? Sorry, is that
Yes.
really right? Adrian, there were more state school kids in when you were there than there are now.
Yeah, it's beginning to change now, because the Oxford and Cambridge are both increasing the admission from the state sector.
The analogous fact is true in the US. No question.
Can I just, Adrian, can I just ask you just to pick up on Daniel's point, because I think the thing that will really resonate with people is that the argument that in the early days of meritocracy, essentially the aristocrats were so dumb they didn't work out how the system worked, and they got taken over by people who did bring innate talent. What if I paraphrase it, Daniel, forgive me, is that essentially the elites now know how to game the meritocratic system so that new talent can't rise.
That's right. And they're clinging on to their, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, Daniel, but they're clinging on to their position at the top. That is definitely the case. And that's happening in Britain and in America. And the question is, what do we do about it? There's one answer, which is to dial down the pressure on meritocracy and to have a less meritocratic system, in a sense. Another solution is to push forward and have a more meritocratic system. Now, remember, we started off by the distinction between innate ability and achievement. What we have at the moment is a system which is selecting people in various ways for achievement, people who are really well taught and have had a huge amount of investment by their parents. So one thing we could do is to try and push forward and to try and make this distinction between innate ability and achievement. Another thing we can do is so what you could do is have more selection of people, and particularly bring selection to state schools. So improve the quality of state schools, making them more academically rigorous. So I would quote, and I have quoted in the past, the example of the Brampton Academy in the East End of London, which is it's very selective at the sixth form, which serves a community of ethnic minorities, of people who are poor enough to have free school meals, but gets more people into Oxbridge every year than Eton does. That's one way to do that, create elite schools. That brings the question of how do you find these hidden Einsteins? I would say one thing you can do is to use IQ tests or various other tests of cognitive ability. But now I think there's an even more exciting thing coming along, and this will probably generate some pushback. But what you're beginning to see is, because we've decoded DNA, we're beginning to see ways of finding people at a very young age and examining their polygenic scores and finding out basically what their intellectual promise is. And you can select these people, almost from birth, select poor people against rich people, look at their polygenic scores and provide enriched education to people who, regardless of their backgrounds, have high academic ability. So this means that we have a bigger and bigger chance of making people's academic opportunities and their innate academic abilities match each other. And there's a lot of interesting research being done on this at the moment.
So just to try, I'm going to try and bring some order to this meritocracy at least. I'm going to get Daniel, I'm going to ask to respond. And then if I might, I'm going to just try and bring in, I saw Anushka Sharma's point, I thought was interesting. Claire Montague's point was interesting. Luke Bedham's point was interesting. So I'm going to come to those three after I've heard from you, Daniel.
Great, thanks. And I'll try to keep the response brief because I want to hear from others also. I'm a little more dubious about the accuracy and promise of this kind of early talent identification science, I think, Adrian, than you are, but I don't think this is the place for us to have that debate because it turns on facts not in evidence. I think the real question for me is the following. As I said a moment ago, an elite US private school invests $75,000 per pupil per year on educating its students. Eton invests a comparable amount. Princeton University invests well over $100,000 per student per year educating its students. And those levels of investments are simply not generalizable. So if the elite is going to continue to invest such enormous amount per pupil in educating its students, then that kind of education will inevitably be a scarce good. And there's going to be enormous selective pressure on who gets it. And the politics of it is going to be such that those with power will find a way to get their children privileged in the getting of it. Mm-hmm. It's also a degree of investment that cannot be generalized. So the solution, in my mind, has to involve, at least in significant measure, diluting and distributing elite education so that nobody gets $75,000 or $100,000 a year spent on their schooling, but many people get $30,000 or $40,000 a year spent on their schooling. And what that will inevitably do is shrink the hierarchy. It won't obviously do away with meritocracy, but to criticize an extreme is not to embrace the opposite extreme. It's to moderate the extreme. And that's the thing I think I'm in favor of.
Can I just ask you one thing, Daniel, which is at the top of, at the very beginning of Adrian's book, there's an incredible thing, which is Adrian points out that no one's ever really written a history of meritocracy, which is all the more remarkable because it's so at the heart of so many different societies' ways of thinking. You can hear Bill Clinton talk about it. You can hear Xi Jinping. You can hear left Margaret Thatcher, Tony Blair. You know, wherever you are on the political spectrum, everyone seems to embrace the idea of success based on merit. And I wonder whether or not that has exaggerated in our own societies an eagerness to ascribe, quote unquote, innate abilities, to see intelligence in people. And I wonder whether or not you think that as a society, we over-emphasize, over-index even what the distinctions in terms of people's quote unquote innate abilities.
Well, I certainly, on the nature-nurture dispute, I'm on the nurture side. Right. Partly because, and I have a dog in this fight, as an educator, I have to believe that the thing that I provide is effective. If it were all nature, I shouldn't be doing what I'm doing. But also, and this is another point that's important, and I don't want to take us too far from the center of what we're talking about, but Paul Samuelson, the economist, had an observation a long time ago, which is that people's natural talents are almost certainly normally distributed. But the returns on their talents in money and status are asymmetrically distributed with a very long tail end. And that tail end has been growing longer and longer over time. And what that means is that whatever it is that turns inputs into outputs can't be in the person. It has to be in our society. So it's in our society that somebody who's only slightly better at something makes 10 or 100 times the wage as somebody who's only slightly worse, even if a lot of how good they are is determined by nature.
So well, let me try and, I'm going to try and get a run of different points of view because they're not necessarily going to hang together and they may not be entirely related one to the other, but let's hear as many voices as we can, and I'm going to come back to you in a moment, Adrian. Let me start, if I can, with Claire Montague. Claire, are you there? Over you.
Yeah.
Claire, far away.
Yeah, sorry. I'm just starting my video. I've just been for a swim, so I just had to do something to make myself a little less disreputable in appearance.
I tried to give you the warning in case. That's right. Okay. Well, I don't think that's remotely disreputable. I think that'll work.
No, I mean, I think the debate is really interesting, but we end up disappearing up a policy on class and only talking about Wooldridge and cleverness and innate ability and intelligence. And if you're not careful, you then end up, I think, ascribing merit to only one section of society. And you can have a debate about how people got to Oxbridge or not. But actually, if we're not careful, we start, either that has a very distorting effect in policy terms in saying that the only thing that counts is people who've gone to elite universities. And it also stops us thinking about what constitutes worth and value in terms of remuneration and success and value in kind of how society views people. If you only talk about elite education, and I mean, you know, things like social care and health and so on after the pandemic, and you look, you know, that well-trodden debate of what CEOs are paid versus what carers are paid. Mm-hmm. And I suppose I worry about a meritocracy debate that is only really about sort of, I don't underestimate the importance of the way in which the elites kind of grab hold of training and use money to secure training and positions for Oxbridge or other elite universities for their own kind of offspring. But it seems that that's still quite a minute sort of element of society.
And we'll come back to that. I know that, I mean, Adrian made this point about the extent to which meritocracy gets corrupted by plutocracy. And so one of the reasons we framed it as we did was around the much broader issues of inequality. So I'm going to take that point back to Adrian in a moment. But can I just bring in a couple of others? I wanted to ask Luke Bedimer, my colleague, what he thinks of that. And I was also going to bring Anushka Sharma in as well. Then I was going to go to John Alexander, if I might. Luke.
Hi, James. I've got quite a few pretty strong feelings about this, not least because I've worked in education previously.
Adrian, sit back and laugh at it because I think it's coming.
Yeah, but the point that I was trying to get across most recently was that I think the concept of meritocracy and the way that it aligns with our kind of imaginings of human progress and of worth and some of the things, Claire, you were just mentioning about how we value people, has really been defined around that person's ability to extract stuff from the environment and accrue it to them and hold on to it. And I think there is going to be a necessary reimagining of that idea of value that goes along with our more serious questions about what type of priority our civilizations need to have in the next 10, 15, 20 years as we try and reach net zero. And actually, regardless of what the corporate jargon around it is, we realize that our civilization is collapsing in line with our biosphere. And so through education and meritocracy, which really should be the root of the tree in terms of what citizens we have, do we have a system that prioritizes empathy and conservation and community and sustained innovation that doesn't just expand endlessly? The idea behind going to Oxbridge for a long time was that your salary would therefore be great, and therefore you'd be able to buy as many material things as you wanted. And I think that paradigm needs to change, and it will be forced to change.
Luke, thank you. Anushka Sharma. Anushka, you there?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. It's great to be back. That classic mute, unmute. It's so interesting. So I work in the space sector, but I've recently joined an academic environment. And so earlier in the chat, I talked about everything as a spectrum of abilities, because I find myself the only non-PhD on a call, but my skill set is entirely valid and valuable to the project that we're all collaborating on. And that is really interesting to me, because if I looked at my paper credentials, nothing would qualify me for the work that I've got under my belt, nor did it qualify me for the work that I'm in now. So there's like imposter syndrome kind of like rearing its ugly head. But equally, I've managed to monetize and run my consultancy based on selling the soft skills that aren't paper credentials that you can earn in an education establishment. It's actually through years of experience of being in very dynamic, fast-paced environments, from politics to the Olympics to tech startups and space. So those key skills that Luke even touched on, like empathy, I'm a sense maker, I'm an intuitive, like all of these things are like some of the hardest things I've had to justify on a pitch to a potential client, having won their business over based on that it's a feeling rather than a tangible thing. So like Luke says, to solve the problems that are really crunching on all of society on our planet, we really do have to think about not only the next generation and the youth in schools today that have been hit by schooling during a pandemic globally, but how are we going to retrain and upskill those mid to senior level people that can transition to other sectors with valid skills when potentially that sector wouldn't recognize them as someone who provides a service because of the shenanigans of a system that locks them out?
It's interesting, and I don't know whether you saw, as you were speaking, someone was writing, are we overemphasizing youth and education in this? How do we think about it more broadly? I'm just going to bring in John Alexander, because John raised a point right at the beginning about the extent to which the idea of meritocracy, includes some and excludes others. John, are you there?
I am, yeah. So a couple of things I'd throw into this. I guess I feel like the whole conversation so far has all been within frame of sort of meritocracy versus aristocracy, is sort of the only kind of binary choice of options that we have. It's interesting to reflect that Michael Young coined the term meritocracy in 1958 in a satirical essay called The Rise of the Meritocracy, where he essentially was arguing that meritocracy was a kind of false god, a kind of fool's gold that would come up because it looked a little bit like aristocracy and kind of made sense as a way to organize society, but would inherently kind of and intrinsically degenerate into another form of oligarchy. And he said it would happen around 2030. I think that was when the kind of populist revolt comes and kills everybody, and including the narrator of the essay, which is, and I guess what I'm interested in, and I'm sort of, I feel like this is what tortoise is why I'm interested in tortoise. Like it's this idea of like, actually it's not about the rule by the noble born or rule by the cleverest. It's designing society and designing institutions and organizations on the basis that all of us are smarter than any of us, and that you can tap into the kind of all of those different types of merit and expertise of experience and joy and wisdom and actually get to something greater if you see people if you see the whole thing not as being a competition to get to the top of the tree and just trying to change the rules of who gets there, but see the whole thing as being about facilitating a process so that everyone can contribute. And I think that's what I would love to hear more of in this conversation. Like, it's not aristocracy or meritocracy. It's like, how do you create democracy, really?
It's a very, I mean, by the way, John, it's a very interesting thing when you read Adrian's book. Actually, one of the things you realize is that wrapped up in the idea of meritocracy is a recognition of the individual that hadn't been the case beforehand. And I suppose, just putting that back to you, Adrian, the question of whether or not actually we need to look beyond aristocracy, meritocracy to a different idea of society, the all of us rather than the one of us.
Yeah.
Will you pick that up, and would you take
Sure.
on some of the points that Claire made around
Sure.
kind of elite view of meritocracy itself and the education and skills question that Anushka
Sure.
and
Let me do that.
I'm going to come to Daniel after that.
Central to the meritocratic idea is the idea that we should judge people as individuals rather than as members of groups, of members of collectivities. And I think that's an incredibly valuable thing and something that we're in danger of losing, particularly from the identitarian left at the moment, which is obsessed by group identities and group rights. And I think that's the judging people as individuals and thinking them as individuals and as in some way designers of their own fate and of their own destiny is something that's central to liberalism. I apologize to Claire, and I think she's right, that we have focused very much on elite recruitment and elite institutions, partly because they have this charisma, to use a phrase that Daniel uses very well in his book, and partly that in my book I focus a lot on these elite institutions because it's a history, and quite often these elite institutions were the only things that were there. They used to be just basically in England, Oxford and Cambridge. Those were the universities. So a lot of what defined meritocracy to start off with was competition to enter a very, very small world. But I would say absolutely central to the idea of merit is, in my view, is the notion of differentiation, selection by differentiation, not selection by elimination. That what we must do is allocate people or let people choose jobs on the basis of their aptitudes and abilities, rather than just on the basis of trying to get into the very top institutions. If they don't get in to those things, being eliminated, forgotten about. And I think one of the things that's gone wrong, paradoxically, as a result of egalitarianism, is that instead of acknowledging that people have different abilities and different aptitudes, we've become absolutely obsessed by academic success as the pure metric, the only metric of things. And that's partly because people say, well, there's no innate differences between people. Everybody can succeed just so long as education is good enough and just so long as people try hard enough. I think that's false. And I think it causes a great deal of misery and a great deal of misspent societal effort. And it's also predicated on a belief which is false. And that is the belief that the only things that matter are cognitive abilities. So selection by differentiation, there are different sorts of abilities which are incredibly valuable. Mm-hmm. And the abilities of a carer and the abilities of a person who can do practical things with their hands is just as important. And we should have allocate value and societal prestige to those people just as much. So this whole notion that the only thing that matters, cognitive elites, is cognitive elites, that's wrong. I can tell you, talk about youth and education as the other thing, but I've talked too long.
I just want to bring Daniel back in, if I might. Daniel.
Yeah, quickly, something on to Anushka and Claire, and then something brief to Luke and John. One of the reasons I think why Adrian and I are talking about the elites is that that's where the money is right now. The distribution of advantage has become so extraordinarily top-heavy that one can't do anything anywhere in society without getting at the privileged elite. Just as an illustration, since the beginning of the pandemic, the US federal government has been leagues more progressive in its spending policy than ever before in American history. It's reduced child poverty in half. It's reduced the poverty rate to all-time historic lows. At the same time, the average household in the top 1% of America has seen its wealth increase by 500 times as much as the average middle-class family has received benefits from the federal government. So unless you go at concentrated privilege, you can't fix the problem. I do think, though, both Anushka and Claire, that you're exactly right to focus on the question, what counts as a skill? What counts as a capacity? Take medicine, for example. We have developed a medical industrial complex that dramatically favors elite trained, super educated specialist doctors who can do things like transplant hearts or install robotic hearts in people. We don't actually know what exercise regimen is best for a person's heart health. We don't actually know what regimen of sleep and diet is best for a person's heart health. We don't have nearly enough trained up nurse practitioners, nutritionists, social therapists, cognitive behavioral therapists, all of whom would be, in our current description, mid-skilled middle-class workers who would collectively do much, much more for heart health than the specialist medical doctors who right now attract all of the scientific investment in a way that massively increases their private pay. So it's very important to get clear about what is a skill and what isn't. And part of my argument about meritocracy is that it distorts that to favor extremes and elites. Very briefly on Luke and John, let me just say, one of the next books I'm working on is tentatively entitled Enough, The Good Life After the Age of Growth. And we are going to have to come up with a new set of ideals that individuals can aspire for and that societies can aspire for to replace accumulation as our principal organizing ideal. The problem is that accumulation and the market-based principles behind it are extremely ideologically deep, and it takes a lot of work to come up with a good alternative.
Daniel, I realize that we've got a massive subject and we've got sort of 15 minutes left to handle it. I want to put two sort of challenging thoughts, if you like, to each of you. I'm going to start with you, if I might, which is, as you know, when I read your book, and I think I read it last year, I was completely electrified by it because it made me feel extremely guilty that I'd bought into an idea that I thought was a good one and was having bad outcomes. And when I read Adrian's book, I thought, I'm so glad I'm getting to talk to you again, because part of the argument in Adrian's book is that meritocracy over time has been self-correcting. Right? In the early days after the American Revolution, actually, Americans' leaders started handing on jobs to their children, and then the Jackson Democrats came along, they started challenging that. And so then I thought, well, actually, maybe there's a third missing of Daniel Markovits' book, which is, and here are the fixes. Here are the things that can sustain the idea of meritocracy and change, and not allow it to succumb to wealth and the plutocrats. And I wondered, you must have been on the circuit now for a while talking about this book, whether or not you've come to the thought, okay, well, here are some of the radical things that would really change and ensure that a system that has worked well for centuries could continue to.
Yeah, so I'm a little more worried about self-correction than Adrian is for the following structural reason. For most of human history, almost all the wealth in society was in land. And then there was a period when some of the wealth was in land and some of the wealth was in machines and factories. And we're now reaching a state in which most of the wealth is in human capital, in the training and skills of free workers. And that's the point at which meritocracy no longer has competing sources of economic wealth and power that can push it to self-correct. So I'm worried about it in that way. Nevertheless, I think there are things we can do. The two things that are most important to do are, first, dramatically democratize education. And by dramatically, I don't mean find hidden or unsung geniuses and bring them into elite institutions with the current hierarchy still in place. I mean, instead, dramatically de-stratify education so that the difference between Oxford and the red bricks and technical schools and community colleges is much, much smaller. So that
Hold on, Daniel,
yeah.
Daniel, hold on 1 second. So I'm just wondering how popular you are as you walk across whatever it is, the quad in Yale. Are you saying essentially blow it up?
Well, so I'm saying two things. So one thing is it's going to blow itself up. If you grow out US university endowments over the next 50 or 100 years at the same rate at which they've grown over the past 30 or 50 years, by the middle of the 22nd century, the 10 richest universities in America will own all of America. That's not going to happen. And so it's unsustainable. And so it has to correct. One place we're already seeing that is that because these elite universities have become de facto social planners, the ideological and social and political pressure on how they admit students and how they run their internal affairs has become almost unbearable in the inside, so that the people in them can no longer focus on teaching and scholarship.
And I won't be the first person to ask.
We're constantly spending all of our time justifying whom we favor and whom we don't. Excuse me?
But Daniel, does that mean that you think personally I should leave Yale? I should go and teach in a different college?
Oh, so that's, look, I'm no more virtuous than anybody else. And so I like the privileges that being at Yale gives me. And I also like the scholarly opportunities it gives me because I care about ideas and not just justice. But do I think it would be much, much better if Yale were less distinctively elite? Absolutely. And I also think that a reasonable person could blame people like me for not doing something different.
Right. So I want to put the flip of that, if I might, to Adrian. Right. So Adrian, when I read your book, with kind of Daniel sort of ringing in my ears, I had this feeling that I've had, I suppose, for 10 years now, which is that people like you and me are deeply part of the problem. Right. That we grew up professionally, you at The Economist, I was at the FT and the Times, that essentially we grew up in a system and we essentially believed in its merits and believed that it enabled people of merit to progress. But actually, increasingly, what people see is that this is a system of self-dealing, and that the principal defense that we make of it, the defense that we make of liberalism, the defense that we make of meritocracy, actually enables the continuing elite to get an even tighter stranglehold on all of the goodies. And, you know, one of the things that you do in the book is address this in the context of race, in the context of Black Lives Matter. And one of the most compelling critiques of liberalism and the most compelling critiques of meritocracy is that when you say, oh, well, if you give the people the chance to progress on the basis of their intelligence and their abilities, you know, all shall be well. And people say, well, that's the exact opposite. What you will do is you will enable those people who already, you know, control the best assets and the best resources to continue to prosper and crowd out everyone else. And that we, people like you and me and the organizations we work for, purport to be principled, but actually, you know, you can see where I'm going with this, allow a rotten system to continue.
Sure. Well, first of all, I'd like to say that I personally was part of what I regard as a great social experiment, which did break down Britain's very class-divided society and open up opportunities. And I was one of the last generation of grammar school people who went on to Oxbridge. And when I went to Oxbridge, the number of state school people was, I think, more than 50%. A lot of them grammar school people from the great northern grammar schools. I went to something called Ludlow Grammar School. And what I saw in the next decade or so, as the result of the comprehensive revolution came through, was a big increase in the number of people from private schools going to Oxford. So the social tone, the intellectual tone, the ethos of the Oxford I went to in the late 1970s, I would say was set by grammar school people. The ethos of Oxford 10 years later was set by people like David Cameron and Boris Johnson, who'd been to Eton. And I have a very vivid memory of seeing Boris Johnson walking through Balliol Quad. I was at Balliol as well, but I happened to be revisiting. I graduated sometime before, walking through Balliol Quad. And I remember thinking to myself in the sort of the echo of the great Labour phrase, they are the masters now. You know, these Etonians, these people are back. So I think we had a regression in terms of social mobility.
Yeah, but Daniel's point, that's exactly what's happening on an
Totally.
international scale now, is
Yep.
that
Yes.
the elites
Yes.
have taken control of meritocracy.
Yes, I mean, so I think there's a question of where you promote people from, you know, and I think that we've reduced social mobility for, as I say, because of the marriage of meritocracy and plutocracy, because of the counterproductive nature of the comprehensive revolution. But I think there are mechanisms available for reigniting meritocracy. And I keep going back to the Brampton Grammar School, the Brampton Academy example, but it is a very striking example.
But I understand that, but can I just take Adrian? Let me just take, because I'm interested that Daniel's next book is thinking about enough and accumulation. Because even as you were speaking, Adrian, and you were talking about selection by differentiation, and I may have be overreaching here, but if you're saying, look, we need to think about different people's abilities, it's not all about cognitive abilities.
Absolutely.
And we then need to have a system that rewards those abilities.
Yes.
At this point, I'm like, hang on a second. We're saying we need a different system, we need a different education system, but we don't have a market economy that rewards those. So those skills and those qualities. And that's my point about liberalism and the existing system playing into the hands of the current establishment. How do we? You're talking about wholesale change.
I think social policy can change the nature of the economy and the rewards in the economy. So I think we can upgrade the importance of vocational education, apprenticeships, of those sorts of skills, you know, practical skills, by creating, as the Germans have, a much more vigorous and.
How do you allocate value, Adrian? You talked about
value is a more difficult thing to allocate, and I think that we in Britain have had a very long-standing prejudice against the practical and in favor of the theoretical or the academic and the rest of it. And how you can reallocate that, I don't know. America, strangely, in the 19th century, didn't have this sort of prejudice that we have. It's got more of a prejudice now. It's drifted in the same sort of direction as we have. But
Can I give an example on this point?
Yeah, go ahead, Daniel. Daniel, I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to bring in Eric, who's got his hand up, and then I'm going to come to you both with some thoughts.
So just on this point, if you think about finance, mid-century finance, you know, Adrian, your publication wrote something asking in the 60s whether finance was the world's most respectable declining industry. It was a mid-skilled middle-class industry, which was based on not terribly educated workers who made financial decisions based on effectively the financial viability of individual investments and individual loans. And finance has transformed itself in the past 30 or 40 years into a super skilled high-tech industry, which is based on derivatives and securitization. Now, it turns out that the old style finance is just as socially efficient as the new style finance. And one way to think about value is to think about restructuring production functions to favor forms of production that themselves favor middle-class workers, rather than that polarize the workforce.
Sorry, Daniel. Sorry, just explain what you mean.
Well, so you know, the key, for example, in home mortgage finance, the key worker in 1970 was the home loan officer. This was somebody who lived in a place and whose job it was to investigate individual borrowers and individual houses to decide whether individual loans were providently made that would be issued by a bank and then serviced by a bank over the course of the loan. Today, that person has been totally de-skilled. They're just a form filler in. And instead, the loan gets securitized, packaged into derivatives, traded in London or New York by super educated, super elite workers. And the result of this is two things. First of all, it does not make finance more efficient. The best economists say it's not more efficient. But second of all, it transforms what was a middle-class industry, which gave large numbers of good jobs to middle-class, mid-skilled people, into an industry that has become synonymous with the super elite plutocratic class.
Right.
And shifting back the production function across field after field after field would rebuild middle skills.
Yeah. Daniel, thank you. Eric, you've patiently waited with your hand up, but I wanted to hear what you had to say.
Thank you so much. So just to introduce myself, I'm Eric Krotzer. I'm a research fellow at Harvard University's Growth Lab. And I wanted to comment on the framing of whether meritocracy is possible or impossible, particularly from Daniel's perspective. It seems to me that much of the criticism of the possibility of meritocracy seems to come from countries that in fact are failures at, not failures of meritocracy, like the US and the UK. When in fact there are other countries such as Canada and Australia and New Zealand and the Nordics that have considerably higher social mobility. So first of all, I suppose there's the issue of why aren't we just striving to emulate those countries more? And second, I suppose there's a matter of thinking about, is it really a matter of demolishing the elites or just redistributing wealth when countries like France, for instance, also have quite poor social mobility, even though they're considerably more interventionist than a lot of these countries that do have high social mobility. So there's a bit of a conundrum that I'd put to you, and I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Daniel, would you answer Eric, and also answer Eric, and then I'm going to ask you for final.
Yeah. So look, I think that the U.S. has much less social mobility than those countries, but it's also much more meritocratic. That is to say, it has greater unusual and exceptional returns to extremes of accomplishment. France also does, actually. It has the most elite university system in the world in certain ways, in terms of the difficulty of gaining admission to elite universities. So we have to separate out meritocracy from equality of opportunity. And I think in a sense, what the meritocracy need to do is to emulate some of those countries which don't have private education by and large, don't have distinctively elite universities, don't have highly financialized economies, don't have management schemes in which elite executives have disproportionate power. They're much more egalitarian, and for that reason, they have more social mobility.
Daniel, thank you. Can I ask you to give us, if you like, a prescription for how we do save meritocracy? And I wondered whether you could pick up on the concluding elements of Adrian's book. Adrian actually, for someone who obviously believes in free markets and free societies, comes out at the end of the book as quite interventionist. So people are going to have to step in and choose more clearly the ways in which the meritocratic game is played. And I wondered what your prescription would be if you were given that authority.
Yeah, so I'm quite interventionist, but one thing I would do initially is undo existing interventions that favor hierarchy and the elite. In the US and in the UK also, private schools and universities are organized as charities, which gives them tax preferred status. Princeton University's tax exemption amounts to a public subsidy of $100,000 per pupil per year. That's 40 times the public subsidy given to a community college in New Jersey. So one thing I would do is I would undo the massive public subsidies that now go disproportionately to rich elite meritocrats. A second thing that I would do is I would change the tax code, and particularly the way in which labor income is taxed. In the US right now, the highest tax factor of production is the middle-class worker, more highly taxed than a machine or an algorithm, more highly taxed than a super elite worker, because of the way in which wage taxation functions. So I would favor a regime that disproportionately taxes super elite labor and subsidizes mid-skilled middle-class labor in order to give employers and capital an incentive to invest in forms of production that are complements to middle-class labor.
Okay, Daniel, thank you. Adrian, I'm going to ask you the same question in a slightly different form, which is the argument of the book, in some ways, that it's most sort of surprising and uplifting is where you talk about the extent to which meritocracy is at the heart of the feminist revolution, that women's emancipation wouldn't have been possible without meritocracy. But the critique of meritocracy, of course, is that it's entrenching structural inequalities. So if you are a believer in a meritocracy that, if you like, can mend itself, can save itself, what does it need to do to amend or to fix those structural inequalities?
Absolutely. The self-correcting capacity of meritocracy is something that I talk a great deal about in my book. And I argue that whenever it's looked as though it was degenerating into a sort of propaganda for plutocrats, it's managed to reach down into society, either because people have deliberately reached down into society and said, we've got to give more opportunity, we've got to build the ladder, or because people have come from marginalized groups and said, we need to be tested by the same standards as them, as with Philippa Fawcett. And the result of that, because ability is distributed, evenly amongst groups of people, is for them to triumph. I would say that there is the question that we haven't discussed in this, and which is haunting us in the background, is the question of racial disparities of performance. Particularly with the African American population in the United States, what one does, but also to some extent in Great Britain, what one does about that. I think affirmative action is a legitimate way of addressing that problem, because we are dealing with a group here of people who've been enslaved to start off with, but have been systematically oppressed in the United States very directly through Jim Crow, in Britain, not through Jim Crow, but with similar effects. And we need, I think, to have affirmative action for that particular group. I see affirmative action as something, as a means to an end. So it's something which I would hope in the very, very long term would become unnecessary, because you wouldn't see these group disparities of the sort that we now have preserved. But I would also add more things. I think if you have selective schools, if you allow what we call academies in this school to select on the basis of academic performance, mathematical ability, musical ability, or overall academic performance, and extend the work of selection from very privileged elite schools to public schools, by which I mean state schools, I think that would have an effect. I think if you test people on the basis of IQ, looking for innate abilities, and allocate positions in state schools on that basis, so that you're selecting for ability rather than just having polished performance in examinations, I think that would help to promote people. I think the worst thing that you can do is what they're doing in the United States at the moment. Boston Latin School and Lowell School in San Francisco are replacing selection by examination or selection by academic performance with selection by a lottery. I think that's disastrously bad. As I say, things like Brampton Academy, which select by academic promise, are the way forward. But I also think that these attempts now, the ability that we have to look at people's polygenic scores and to find talent just by examining their essentially their genetic makeup, means that we can find people who come from underprivileged backgrounds and give them accelerated academic opportunities. I think all of these things combined together will eliminate these differences that we see between middle-class groups and ethnic groups, and we will get a true reflection of the distribution of abilities rather than of the distribution of privileges.
Well, Adrian, thank you, and Daniel, thank you. Listen, I find this conversation really fascinating, and it's really interesting, isn't it, when we talk about these things, if you like, in a public forum, how we pause and feel these moments of awkwardness. I'm well aware of the fact that here are we three white men talking about crisis of meritocracy, and it's a discussion about openness and fairness, and I'm aware of that. But I suppose the thing that makes me feel even more acutely awkward is that I feel at my age, and given the advantages I've had, this sense that we're in a crisis of incrementalism, that each in our own ways, living in the institutions that we have, whether it's Yale or The Economist, or in my case, places like the FT and the Times and the BBC, you look and you think to yourself, hang on a second, we're living through what Daniel described, to my mind, as an education emergency. It's unsustainable what's happening in our education systems, and yet we keep on tweaking it. And it feels to me as though we're also dealing with a system where, you know, your point, Adrian, about plutocracy, you know, corrupting the meritocracy, about a systemic self-dealing that's not quote unquote corruption. It's actually within the rules. It's the gaming of that system. And so for us, you know, I do take John Alexander's point, which is it's not just about aristocracy versus meritocracy. It's where that meritocracy goes next. So I hope that we'll take that forward, because it does feel as though there are a bunch of really practical questions here. So it's not just principles and ideas. It is education funding, it is tax, it is the question about enough and accumulation. And it certainly does feel that the point that Eric made at the end, which is not the failures of meritocracy, but failures at meritocracy, is quite a good, you know, test for us to take away. So I'm sorry, I'm speaking quickly because it feels as though there are lots of ideas and not enough time. Perhaps that's the beauty of getting the chance to read in a slower way, both your book, Daniel, and yours, Adrian. Can I really recommend them? You'll probably end up as energized and slightly confused as I am, but you will definitely think more deeply about it. So do go and read The Meritocracy Trap. Do go and read The Aristocracy of Talent and make your own mind up. For now, a big thank you to Daniel Markovits at Yale and Adrian Wooldridge here in the UK. Thanks very much.
Thank you both. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
See you again soon.